A few years ago, Canada changed the face of its $10 bill. For a long time, Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, was on the 10, but as you may be aware from my video about him, today he's quite the controversial figure because he started the genocidal system of forcing Indigenous children into residential schools. Now the Canadian civil rights hero Viola Desmond's face is on the 10, with the theme of Canada's ongoing effort to improve human rights and civil rights across the country. Earlier this year, the Bank of Canada announced that it would be looking for suggestions for a new face for the $5 bill. Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier's face has been on the bill for several years. I consider myself somewhat of a Laurier fan, and I believe that he's one of the best prime ministers. However, I think changing the bill would be a good idea to highlight a lesser-known historical figure who is not a politician. So many people have come up with their own suggestions. The Bank of Canada actually just released a long list of 600 nominees, and most of them are fantastic suggestions. Terry Fox, artist Emily Carr, hockey players Tim Horton and Jacques Blount, and ace pilot Billy Bishop are all among the nominees. There are so many people on that list that would make a great face for the new $5 bill, but there's a name that stands out to me as someone who genuinely deserves it the most. Tommy Prince was a Canadian soldier in the Second World War and Korean War who holds the distinction of being the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. Despite his decorations, some of the toughest battles that he had to face were on the home front and after the war, as he was subjected to horrendous racism and discrimination on the basis that he was a First Nations man. So in today's lesson in Canadian, we'll look at the life and legacy of Sergeant Tommy Prince and why I think he deserves to be the new face of Canada's $5 bill. Thomas George Prince was born on October 25th, 1915 in Petersfield, Manitoba. He grew up on the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation with a large family, being one of 11 children. When he was 5 years old, he was taken from his family and forced into a residential school. Prince survived the system, and when he was back with his family, he joined the cadets, and his father taught him how to hunt. During those years, he became an excellent marksman, and he aspired to become a lawyer. Unfortunately, the Great Depression put those plans to a stop, and Prince worked as a lumberjack, among other odd jobs. When Canada entered the Second World War in 1939, Prince tried to enlist, but just like many other young Indigenous men, he was rejected solely on the basis that he was an Indigenous person. Prince kept on trying to enlist, and in June of 1940, he joined the Royal Canadian Engineers, beginning his military career as a sapper. With the engineers, Prince got bored because his unit was mostly performing guard duty. So in 1942, he joined the Canadian Parachute Battalion and was posted to the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion. With the Special Services, Prince was among a group of Canadians who were tasked to train with some American Special Service units to form a combined assault group. That highly trained unit, the 1st Special Service Force, would be given the nickname the Devil's Brigade. With the Devil's Brigade, Prince distinguished himself among his comrades with his shooting and survival skills that he had learned on reserve. In early 1944, the Special Forces were on the front lines of the Italian campaign. The forces were posted to Anzio, Italy, when Prince volunteered for a dangerous surveillance mission. Prince was tasked with running a 1,400-meter long communication wire from the Canadian line to an abandoned farmhouse that was located 200 meters from a German artillery position. For 3 days, Prince provided detailed information about the German position while remaining undetected by the enemy. One day, the wire was damaged by German artillery, and it needed to be fixed. So, Prince dressed up like an Italian farmer and walked around pretending to work the field. The funny thing is that the Germans probably saw him out there and they didn't ask him any questions. They must have assumed that he was just some random Italian farmer working in the field. Prince fixed the wire, pretending to be tying his bootlace, and returned to the abandoned house while comically shaking his fist at both sides. With the information Prince provided, the German positions were destroyed and the Allies were able to advance. Prince continued to show incredible valiance throughout the war. In September 1944, he was posted to northern France when he was tasked with leading another dangerous reconnaissance mission. The objective was to locate a German camp behind enemy lines and report the information back to headquarters. With no food, water, or sleep, Prince traveled by foot over 72 hours, successfully bringing the information about the camp back to his headquarters. A few days later, his unit used the intel to capture the camp and take over 1,000 German prisoners. For his brave efforts, Prince was awarded 11 medals, making him the most decorated Indigenous Canadian, as well as one of the most decorated non-commissioned officers. In June 1945, Prince was honorably discharged from the army and returned to Manitoba as a war hero. During the fighting, he was an equal to his comrades and was treated with a lot of respect and dignity, but back home was a completely different story. Prince faced a lot of racism from the Canadian government and his fellow Canadians. For one, he and his fellow Indigenous Canadians did not have the right to vote. Also, Prince was given less veterans benefits than the average returning soldier. Prince had to make do with what he had, and eventually he was able to make a living as the owner of a cleaning company. Prince was asked by the Manitoba Indian Association in 1946 to join its executive and serve as a spokesperson about Indigenous issues. Prince accepted and became a very powerful voice for the organization. Prince spoke to the House of Commons in Ottawa about systemic issues Indigenous Canadians face, especially with regards to education and sanitation. He also wanted to see the Indian Act abolished, but unfortunately his calls for action were largely ignored and he continued to try to find work. In 1950, Canada was heading to war again, this time in Korea. Prince decided to enlist again and he joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, or the Princess Pats. Prince was a battle-hardened soldier, but the Korean War was a different war compared to the Second World War, in the sense that it was largely defensive with the odd raid against the enemy. Prince also struggled with bad knees and was often reminded of the trauma of the previous war effort. But he kept on fighting, and even through shrapnel injuries, he kept on fighting. Eventually, the battle exhaustion caught up to him, and he would spend much of early 1953 in a military hospital, never returning to battle again. Later that year, he was once again honorably discharged. Civilian life continued to present challenges to Prince. He and his wife, Ernest Sinclair, had 5 children and were moving back and forward between Winnipeg and the Broken Head Reserve. He struggled to find work, largely because of employment discrimination. Even when he had work, he often quit out of embarrassment because of the racism he had to deal with from his co-workers. By 1961, the trauma of the war got the best of him and he descended into heavy alcoholism. He and Verna separated in 1964 and their children went to foster homes. Prince continued to work the odd job and he was often a guest of honor at Remembrance Day ceremonies, but at the end of the day he was still poor, living out of a suitcase and haunted by the trauma of the war, and he was also still struggling with alcoholism. In 1976, Prince was found to be living in a Salvation Army service center. He had managed to overcome his alcoholism and was even reunited with his children. Sadly, he was still struggling with the physical injuries he had sustained and he never overcame the trauma of the war. He struggled to sleep and it was mainly because of all the nightmares he had from his time overseas. On November 27, 1977, Sergeant Tommy Prince died in hospital at the age of 62. He was buried at a military cemetery in Winnipeg and was given a full military funeral with dignitaries in attendance and had members of his regiment, the Princess Pats, as pallbearers. While researching this video, I couldn't help but to get genuinely frustrated with how Tommy Prince was treated in his post-war life. He really deserved better than what he got. Unfortunately, this story is all too familiar with Indigenous people in Canada because this is how they've been historically treated, and they continue to be treated like that today. In the years that followed Prince's death, efforts were made to honor his life and legacy. There were many Tommy Prince statues that were erected across Canada, and several schools, military facilities bear his name. Also, Parks Canada has Prince on their list of persons of national significance. Well, one of the mysteries that was going around after Tommy Prince had died is where had his medals gone? It was believed that he had sold them when he was poor and just needed to survive. But that was the case for over 20 years until they turned up at an auction in London, Ontario. Prince's family wanted the medals back, but the only way they could acquire them was by purchasing them. So a group of private donors came together and purchased the medals for $75,000 and donated them back to the family. The medals are now on display in a museum. So now we're in 2020. In April, the Bank of Canada released the 600 names of people who are being considered as the new face of the $5 bill. And yeah, sure enough, Tommy Prince made the list. And a few days before Canada Day, a group of members of Parliament launched an online petition calling on the Minister of Finance to give Prince the honor of being on the $5. Overall, it seemed to be a very well-received move, with members of the Prince family and the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation being strongly in favor of it. At the same time, I think that one of the best ways that we can honor Prince's legacy is by coming together, making this country a better place for all Indigenous people, and ending the systemic racism that Indigenous people continue to face. But still, putting Tommy Prince on the bill is a fantastic idea. My hope would be that Canadians look at Prince's face, learn his story, understand the systemic issues he and other Indigenous people have had to face in Canadian history, and work together to make this country a better place for everyone. Tommy Prince survived the residential school system. He fought for a country that didn't believe he deserved equal rights. He went above and beyond to be a hero, and then he came back to face brutal racism and discrimination. Let's make things right for Sergeant Tommy Prince. Let's put his face on the $5 bill, and let's work towards making this country better for everyone. So, what do you think? Should Tommy Prince be the new face of the $5 bill? Make your case for or against it in the comment section below. I have once again included a list of some of the sources I've used in the description. Please don't forget to like, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next lesson in Canadian.